All right, we looked at Solomon a little bit last Monday. A lot of things have happened since last Monday, so we better review just a bit. This is my last class. I know you guys probably had class during the day on Monday, but I did not, so this is my last class. And I feel like it's been 3 or 4 weeks ago since I had class last because of Party Youth. So we started into Solomon. I mentioned some of the differences in the way that Solomon was raised and the way that David was raised. Solomon had a very, very different upbringing. David the shepherd and Solomon raised in a palace. David raised fighting battles at a very young age, killing Goliath, and then in the national spotlight after that. Solomon, he grew up in relative peace. And he got to enjoy a lot of luxury that David never had until he was older. So there's a number of comparisons between David and Solomon. Then we also looked at one of Solomon's half-brothers, I guess it would be, who tried to take the throne first. And David, of course, had to put Solomon in his place. Come on in. Solomon had to put Solomon in the place of the king. And, of course, Adonijah was not happy about that. And later on, Solomon has to consolidate the throne. And, of course, later on, Adonijah dies. As a result, he was one of the 4 who was put to death. So Solomon then removes the enemies. That's another very important thing we looked at. I put that under his program as the king. He has 4 major enemies removed: Adonijah, Abiathar, a priest, Joab, executed in the tabernacle, I guess it would be, and then Shimei was executed for not listening, and of course he was a traitor, and he was not to be trusted from the beginning because of things that he had done in the past. All right, so let's continue with Solomon's program as the king. I've got quite a few things. Most of our time today will be spent looking at things he did as the king. And then the last thing we'll briefly look at the very end is his decline and the reasons for that. So let's look at what he does as king. We said, first of all, he removed his enemies. And then I touched on some building programs just the last few minutes. We looked at some pictures, and I brought some of those with me again. We had quite a few of you that were not here on Monday for various reasons, hopefully in part youth related. Yes. Next thing we want to look at, besides the removal of his enemies, the next thing after that is the prayer for wisdom in 1 Kings chapter 3. 1 Kings chapter 3. Solomon's prayer for wisdom. This takes place evidently very soon into his reign. And he's not in Jerusalem when this happens. He's in Gibeah. Chapter 3, Gibeon, sorry, not Gibeah. He's in Gibeon. Chapter 3, verse number 4. The king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there, for that was the great high place. 1,000 burnt offerings did Solomon offer upon that altar. Now, there's a good question here of why a high place? Why a high place? Why does he go to a location where there's a high place? Any thoughts on that? Wasn't the high place typically the location where the heathen would go to worship? Any thoughts on that at all? Jonathan?
If he went up there, then he would have to worry about them going up there, I guess.
So he's taking their place so they can't have it? All right. Anyone else? Jared?
Well, mostly these were, like you hear about the high places that were removed, but that was later on. So maybe this time they were godly places where you could go and worship that were later, but turned to idols.
Okay.
So they could have started out as good.
All right. I believe the high place is mentioned before this also. I could be wrong. I didn't look at...
What they mentioned is what the king said.
Yes, that's true.
I don't remember.
Seems like in the book of Joshua and Judges, especially in Judges, there were high places mentioned. Okay, anyway, I didn't study that aspect of it out, but what I was going to mention is that the city of Jerusalem is on a high place. And from the city of Jerusalem, the city of David, Solomon expanded up the hill and put the Temple Mount, obviously, on a high place. For what I was going to mention is that for Solomon and for David and for these other good kings, when they worshipped on a high place, it wasn't necessarily with the same intent to get closer to God or be able to show the supremacy of your God, even though in a sense you could say that that was the case here. He's lifting up the name of God, literally putting it on a hilltop. But Mount Moriah was the highest location, pretty much, I believe, anywhere within many miles for sure. So there's nothing wrong with worshiping on a high place, worshiping God. Unless you're following the world's methods, which I don't believe he's doing here. I believe he's lifting up the name of God by going to a high place in the land. All right, but his prayer for wisdom, what does he do? He's offered riches. He's offered great power, victory in battle, and he rejects all of that. And he says, Lord, give me wisdom. He asks simply for wisdom. Verse 5, ask what I shall give thee, God said. And Solomon said, Thou hast shown unto thy servant David my father great mercy, according as he walked before thee in truth and in righteousness and in uprightness of heart with thee. And thou hast kept for him this great kindness, that thou hast given him a son to sit on his throne as it is this day. So he says, verse 9, give therefore thy servant an understanding heart to judge thy people. You young men going out into the ministry, this is a good way to start. Okay? More than give me a big church, more than give me a great ministry to work in, it should be give me an understanding heart as a leader of God's people to be able to lead these people. Give me wisdom. If you seek after that, I believe the principle is the same. God is pleased when we seek after what the book of Proverbs calls many times the principal thing. The number one priority is wisdom, and everything else will take care of itself. And so he says, give me an understanding heart. Solomon requested discernment when God offered him anything. And so he received wisdom as well as everything else. Now, go to chapter 3 there. You'll see verse number 12, going down to verse number 12. Behold, I have done according to thy words. Lo, I have given thee a wise and an understanding heart, so that there was none like thee before thee, neither after thee shall any arise like unto thee. And I have also given thee that which thou hast not asked, both riches and honor, so that there shall not be any among the kings like unto thee all thy days. I don't believe there's been any person as wise as Solomon in history because of verse number 12. But the riches of verse 13, it doesn't say that he was more rich than anybody that ever lived, but any king of his day, he was richer than any of those kings. Well, you see then Solomon's wisdom on display in verse 16. Solomon's great wisdom. Then came there 2 women that were harlots unto the king and stood before him. Wow, here we go. You need wisdom. The one woman said, O my Lord, I and this woman dwell in one house, and I was delivered of a child with her in the house. Came to pass the 3rd day after that I was delivered, that this woman was delivered also, and we were together. So we both had a child, and we both lived in the same house. And then this woman, she overlaid her child, and her child died. The one harlot, as they would do back in those days, I'm assuming they didn't sleep in the same, or they did sleep in the same bed. They didn't use a crib as we would use it now for babies. There's all kinds of of warnings out there about how to take care of your little baby. And so a lot of people say you should never sleep in the same bed. You know, you might, I don't know. People are made different. I think I would, if I had somebody laying there next to me and they moved, it would wake me up. That's why our kids never slept in our bed. We always had them out in a different room. That's the way we did it. So I can sleep. Sleep is important, right? But anyway, so this woman laid on her child, and her child died. She arose at midnight and took my son from beside me while I was sleeping, and she switched the babies. Put the dead baby in my bed, and I woke up the next morning, and there was not my baby, and it was dead. All right, you ladies, you know, us guys, we think that all babies look alike. Women don't think that, okay? They know the difference, and so these women, they would definitely have known the difference. And as soon as she wakes up and sees not her baby, but the other woman's baby in her bed, and the baby's dead, she knew right away what had happened. Okay, so they come to the king, and what does the king do? Boy, you know, we know the story, so it's easy for us to say, oh yeah, that's a simple answer. No, that is an unbelievable response by Solomon to figure out how to find the dead baby, or I'm sorry, the real mother. How to find the real mother. You know, I have often thought, there's no way I would have come to that conclusion. To say, let's take the live baby, we'll split the baby and give you each half of the living baby. And of course, the mother of the true baby is going to defend her. And the mother of the dead baby, mother of the living baby, would defend her. And the mother of the dead baby would be all for the idea. She doesn't care at that point. So we see Solomon's great wisdom on display very quickly. And everybody, the Bible says, that everybody in Israel heard of his wisdom. Verse 28. All Israel heard of the judgment which the king had judged, and they feared the king, for they saw that the wisdom of God was in him to do judgment. They recognized Solomon's wisdom. Now, this is not the only display of Solomon's wisdom. So this is one of the displays. Let's mention several more. Solomon also spoke many proverbs. Turn to chapter 4. Excuse me. Excuse me. Verse 32. Well, verse 30, it goes back. Solomon's wisdom excelled the wisdom of all the children of the east country and all the wisdom of Egypt. By the way, who's the east country? Any ideas on that? East from Jerusalem. Rick?
Could be like Persia or India.
Persia, India, the Chaldeans. Sorry? Assyrians. I'm not sure the Assyrians were really. The Chaldeans the Chaldeans were early.
It's the land of Asher, the people of Asher.
Yes.
Yeah.
So probably the Chaldeans is what I've understood. Known for their great wisdom about things, different sciences and so on. and his wisdom excelled their wisdom. They had, presumably thousands of years, at least a couple thousand years, of where they had really compiled a lot of wisdom. I say several thousand years. Obviously, the flood was probably somewhere in there. Verse 31, for he was wiser than all men. Verse 32, and he spake 3,000 proverbs. Okay, there's an example again of his wisdom. 3,000 proverbs. Those proverbs are about different things that we, to this day, of course, we have the book of Proverbs. But there was much more than just the book of Proverbs. There were many proverbs about sciences and about, which I'm having you do. Did you already do yours? Yes? Some of you did, I think. Maybe not all of you, because you can move those around a little bit. But he knew a lot of things without going into a library and reading a science book. You know, we know a lot of things in our elementary school now. Things that are common knowledge, but that back in these days were not common knowledge. And he expounded on these things, and God gave him wisdom in the sciences. He also composed over 1,000 songs. Verse 32 also says his songs were 1,005. Have any of you ever written songs? You're kind of embarrassed to say if you have, huh? Robert's like, you know. And there's nothing wrong with it. You know, obviously it's good if you write some good songs. But he wrote over 1,000 songs. Anybody know how many Fanny Crosby wrote? One of the greatest songwriters of all time. Nobody knows? Seems like it's in the several hundred, 400 or 500 songs. Okay, so that puts it into some context. And just mention a couple other things. He possessed vast knowledge about plant and animal life. Plant and animal life. And I'll remind you, this is a time when there weren't science books to look up. There were not, and there was no Wikipedia or whatever else internet website you can look up to find information. His advice was sought by kings of all nations. Kings of all nations came to him for advice. And you'll see that in the next several chapters. If you read through there, you'll see kings coming to him. Sheba, the queen of Sheba, from Africa, coming up to hear and see his wisdom on display. Okay, so this is the type of fame that he had around the world. He's unbelievably wise. Next, let's talk about his building programs. I touched on this real quickly, and I want to mention more than just the temple. But the temple, of course, is a very important part of it. In 1 Kings chapter 5 through chapter 8, these are the chapters that deal with the construction of the temple. And so I showed you some pictures last time we had class of the construction of that temple. This is a model of Jerusalem that in the city of Jerusalem, it's a much smaller scale, obviously, a small scale, but it still covers, I believe, about an acre. So it's a huge area that is a rebuild of what the city of Jerusalem looked like around the time of Christ. And then they've got it split up into different areas. And this highlighted area is the city of David. And Solomon expanded up onto the mountain more and built a platform for the temple, and then built a temple on top of that platform. Much smaller than the platform that's there today. This is what's there now. This is what's there now. The city of David probably being about this area, and then expanded from here on up onto the Temple Mountain, and a smaller platform than this with the temple on top of that. Okay, so let's talk about this temple a little bit. The preparation for the building of it. Solomon got most of the materials from David, his father. He got most of the materials. 1 Chronicles chapter 22 talks about these materials. Chapter 22 and chapter 29 talks about the materials that he got from David, his father. And so we talked about this already, but let's just remind ourselves. Gold, silver, humongous stones, cut stones, lots of wood. And Solomon, of course, had a lot more to get as well. 2 Chronicles chapter 2 tells us the workers that Solomon used. So the materials, the workers. Now, think with me and just imagine these numbers in your mind. 2 Chronicles chapter 2 tells us that he had 70,000 common laborers. These are not skilled laborers. These are 70,000 common laborers. Now, I've worked with Work Party around here for a long time. We don't have anywhere close to 1,000 people here on a Monday night. We might have several hundred men. It's hard to keep several hundred men busy. And so I can't even comprehend having thousands, 70,000 men. Now, back in those days, they didn't have a tractor to haul things around. They didn't have, things that we take for granted that one or two big machines can do now. They would have had hundreds of workers on them and different methods of moving things. But anyway, laborers. They also had 80,000 stone cutters and movers. I don't think they had unions to, who's allowed to cut and who's allowed to move. But 80,000 stone cutters. He had 3,600 foremen, what we would think of as a foreman, somebody to run the job site. He had almost 4,000 people running the job sites. Okay? And then, I just think of communicating to those 3,600, this is what we want to do next. Of course, it wasn't Solomon directly communicating, I'm sure, but he would have had people over those foremen. And so, an unbelievable, and this again shows, I think, the wisdom of Solomon in being able to figure out how to get all of these people doing their jobs and still having it look nice. We always joke at Work Party about, why something is not looking right. It's because an unskilled laborer did it. Well, to be able to put this kind of a plan of workforce into action and keep it looking right took an unbelievable lot of planning and wisdom on the part of Solomon. And then the plans themselves for the temple came from God himself. 1 Chronicles chapter 28. The architectural plans came from the Lord. The Lord told them exactly how to build the temple. I wish someday I need to just take a lot of time and work on understanding the architectural plans for the temple. I've seen pictures of people pictures of people's plans that they've discussed and figured out for what the temple would have looked like. But it literally describes everything from the posts, how they were supposed to be carved, overlaid with gold, what kind of wood underneath, all of the decorations and the designs. We think that we have seen some buildings that look beautiful. If you've ever seen buildings that had all kinds of ornate designs on them, the temple would have been like that and much more. Okay, so whenever I go to the Wrigley building, across the street, the Tribune Tower, right there downtown, if you look way up where the radio broadcast is, right inside the window, that building looks straight up. And you'll see all kinds of ornate designs about 400 or 500 feet in the air, it seems like. Beautiful. I love a lot of detail. And the temple would have been like that. And those plans came from God himself. He also had, concerning the temple, he also had a lot of help from foreign kings who gave him the wood and the stone. Where did the stone come from? The stone didn't come from Israel primarily. They believe the stone was brought in, cut somewhere, and brought in. Same with the cedar. The cedar came from Lebanon. The material was dyed a certain color, different colors. There were dyeing experts. Those were not funeral directors. There were engravers, skilled engravers that came from foreign kings, especially from Hiram of Tyre. That would be up in Lebanon. Okay. All right, when they finished the temple, in 1 Kings chapter 8, they finished the temple and they had a huge dedication service. Now, I don't have time to tell you all. There was a big prayer prayed that day by Solomon, and you'll remember that prayer, 1 Chronicles 7:14, if my people which are called by name. That was prayed at the dedication of that temple. But at that dedication ceremony, let me just give you these numbers. There were 22,000 oxen sacrificed. 22,000 oxen. Anybody remember how many sheep were sacrificed? By the way, this could not have been one day. This is not a one-day dedication. Probably, my guess is a month. How many sheep? Anybody remember? 120,000. 120. Just to have I've been in big, huge barns filled with cows. Okay, it's not a good smell. Let me tell you, it is a terrible smell. I don't know how many cows are in there, but there are probably several thousand, 4,000 or 5,000 head of cattle in there. We're talking 22,000 oxen and all these sheep. Just the holding pens for these kinds of numbers. Wow, goodness. 2 Chronicles chapter 7 talks about it. 1 Kings chapter 8 talks about it. How long did it take to build the temple? 7 years. 7 years of building. Okay, let's move on. Several other building programs. Obviously, the temple was his main accomplishment, but there's also several other things. He built 5 houses. 5 houses. Why would he need 5 houses? I don't know. You'll have to ask some of these rich guys that have lots of houses why they need lots of houses. His wives. Very good point. Very good point. He also built treasure cities. Treasure cities. Okay, now, before you just say, oh, a treasure city, what in the world? Think about what would go into a treasure city. What is it for? To house treasure. Okay? Anybody know or recognize the name Fort Knox, Kentucky? Isn't that not the place where they store, supposedly, the bars of gold? Think of that and think of the amount of protection that it would take to house a bunch of gold. Okay? He built cities, walls, probably built up the cities on hills, huge embankments to raise the ground level, and then built cities on top of that, walls, fortresses, the city gates that we talked about last time we had class. Here we go. This is an actual gate of Solomon at Megiddo. This is a, what would you call it, reconstruction of the city of Megiddo and its walls, the gated system. Anyway, treasure cities, it would have taken a lot of planning, a lot of work, and a lot of protection to keep those riches safe. So these are some of his building accomplishments. Obviously, the main one is the temple. Okay, let's move on. Several other things that have to do with the program of Solomon as king. Next, we want to talk about the appointment of his administration. I won't take too long on each one of these, but I do think we need to at least look at a couple of the verses that deal with each one of these. He had an unbelievable administration. Now, all of that is nice as long as you have lots of money and the people are happy. Okay? If you're winning battles, everything's going great, the people are going to be happy and not, they're not too bothered by paying lots of taxes. And so this administration and the money is rolling in. The IRS of Solomon's day was collecting all kinds of taxes. Everybody's happy for a while. But when your foreign relations start to break down and the people become less happy, these high taxes have to take a turn. And of course, that's going to happen at the end of Solomon's reign. But his administration was an unbelievable thing. When the Queen of Sheba came, she said, "The half had not been told me." And I think she was mostly referring to his administration and how his servers served and how his workers worked. And everybody did their job and thousands of people were fed on the court tab every day and all these kinds of things. This is his administration. Let me mention to you some of these things, and this always blows my mind. I can't believe the amount of work just in organizing this kind of thing. He fortified cities and supply centers around Israel. We see this in 1 Kings chapter 9, verse 15. 1 Kings chapter 9, verse 15. This is the reason of the levy which King Solomon raised for to build the house of the Lord and his own house in Millo, the wall of Jerusalem, and Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer. Those are the 3 fortified cities. For Pharaoh, king of Egypt, have gone up and taken Gezer and burnt it with fire and slain the Canaanites that dwelt in the city and given it for a present unto his daughter, Solomon's wife. Here you go. Have a city. And Solomon built Gezer and Beth-horon, the nether, and Baalath, and Tadmor in the wilderness in the land. All the cities of store that Solomon had, and cities for his chariots, and cities for his horsemen. What's he doing? He's stocking up. Why would you need cities of store? Storage cities. Hello? Anybody? Yes?
Good reserve, something did happen.
Okay.
All that stuff there to keep the economy going.
Okay. Do you think that God wanted him to build storage cities? What do you think? Is there anything wrong with this? The Bible doesn't say whether God was against that or not. Joel?
He wasn't supposed to have horses, was he?
Okay. No.
And he had a lot of horses.
A lot of horses.
David wasn't supposed to have any.
Sure. Well, the book of Deuteronomy warns against going back to Egypt for horses and to supply. So this is Hazor, and some of these would have been for storage. Here's a bunch of long buildings. Some of them also were used for horse, storing lots of horses. We talked about that last Monday. But absolutely, he definitely wasn't supposed to multiply to himself horses. He wasn't supposed to multiply to himself wives, and so on. There's several things that he did wrong there. But anyway, so storage cities, I kind of tend to think that God wanted the people to trust him. And that when they sinned and they were punished, that they'd run out of food. That's what happened during the days of the judges. So it would be a motivation to stay on the right path, stay on the right track. Fortified cities. He also stored chariots, 1,400 chariots. 1 Kings 10, verse 26 tells us this. Solomon gathered together chariots and horsemen. He had 1,400 chariots, 12,000 horsemen. And he put those in cities scattered throughout Israel, in the fortified cities. So it's kind of like having a bunch of fighter jets scattered around the nation. And as soon as you need something, boy, you send out all of these jets to quickly take action. That's what these are for. Chariots and horsemen scattered throughout Israel. And boy, you need anything, and poof, there they come. This is his way of protecting Israel, and it was absolutely effective in that day. He had a prime minister, 1 Kings 4:5. His name is Zabud. Zabud, I don't know how you say his name. Z-A-B-U-D. He had a prime minister to coordinate the administration. He also had 12 district officers. 12 district officers. I imagine that was according to the tribes, the 12 tribes. And then, along with his administration, he had a lavish court. A lavish court. Now, I don't know what else to call that, but that would be his, you don't think necessarily of a courtyard. Think of a court with all of his workers and administration, all of his rulers, and all of his wives and children. Okay? So We know the story. He had 1,000 wives, 700 wives, and 300 concubines, is to be exact. And many, many, many children. By the way, concubines, with this many wives, obviously, it wasn't like he was always spending time with every single wife. He had them scattered throughout many homes throughout Israel and Jerusalem. Okay? What does this say to the people? Does it just say, wow, this guy's rich? Did they admire Solomon for his great power that was shown by having so many wives? What do you think the people thought? Yes, Robert.
Well, the people suffered in a way because of all his lavishness, because they had to work for him. He probably took some of their daughters for his wives,
Mm-hmm.
So it's not like they were proud of him. I would say they probably resented him.
You think they probably resented him? Joel, you have something to add to that?
He didn't care about them. He cared about himself.
Sure. Okay, so when he's at 300, and he says, I'd like to have your daughter as my wife. Well, what would you think? Your daughter. Oh, like you don't have enough. I'm sure there were many, many people in Israel who were godly and who said, wait a second, this is ridiculous. Just like we, obviously, every time this story is told, we just like, wow, what an idiot. I'm sure people at that time said, this guy's an idiot. It's time for him to wake up. This is ridiculous. When you're at 30, it's ridiculous. When you're at 300, it's off the charts. When you're at 1,000, I don't know what to describe it as. My goodness, what are you doing? Do you really need to show your military power and your political strength by having this extreme number of wives? His father had 6 or whatever it was. To go from 6 to 1,000? Are you kidding? I'm sure I'm giving you my impression of it, and I'm just saying I really believe people at that time felt the same way. Okay, his financial support is another area of his program as king. Removal of his enemies, prayer for wisdom, building programs, the appointment of his administration. Oh, by the way, I didn't tell you about his lavish court, did I? I'm sorry. I should at least read it. 1 Kings chapter 4, verse 22. Let's read a couple of verses here that tell us what they ate every day in the court. Solomon's provision for one day, 30 measures of fine flour. Now what's a measure? Probably something close to a bushel. Okay, so we're talking 30, 50-pound bags of flour every day. Something equivalent to that probably. 80 measures of meal. By the way, the fine flour is extra fine. It's the really sifted, refined. And then 80 measures of meal. That would be your more coarse flour. 10 fat oxen. He had full-time butchers. Many of them, every day, butchering animals. That's all they did. 20 oxen out of the pastures. 100 sheep every day. Beside harts, roebucks, fallow deer, and fatted fowl. Those would be smaller, like deer and mountain goat type animals. Smaller, thin, not much meat on them. But this is every day. Okay? And the people are eating, here's poor people bringing to the temple, a dove or a pigeon. If they were poor, they're giving their birds, and he's eating, the finest of the finest every day, and with all of his lucky enough people who are lucky enough to be a part of the administration. It's not right. It sets a bad testimony. I'm telling you, it makes people resent. And we see that, and it's easy to say that because we know the whole story. It's easy to say that. We know what happened at the end of his reign, and when he died, the country said, enough's enough. We're tired of all these taxes. All right, let's talk about the financial support. I'll go through this quickly. There was taxation, bringing money in. I don't know exactly. I'm sure it wasn't based on income. It would have based on possessions. So whatever you have, you gave some of that every year to the government. Taxation. Chapter 4 talks a lot about the taxation that came in and how they collected it and so on. There were people in place, the IRS agents collecting taxes, okay? Each of the 12 districts of the government, remember there were 12 district officers, each of the 12 districts supported the government 1 month out of the year. Okay, so that means 1/12 of the money that came into the government. In other words, each district, each area paid 1/12 of the government's needs. Needs, hard to call them needs when you're eating like this. But each group, so in other words, 1/12. That'd be like as if you worked for the government for 1 month. And that was it. By the way, we work for the government more than that now. You realize that? Our taxes, if somebody makes $30,000 a year and they pay $3,000 in taxes, they're working 1/10 of the year. You understand? So generally, corporate taxes are much higher than, no, not generally, way higher than 20, 25%, 30%, 50% in some cases. So you're working for the government half the year. Isn't that nice? So there was also labor conscription. People had to work literally for the government for a time period every year. Chapter 5, verse 13. King Solomon raised the levy out of all Israel, and the levy was 30,000 men, and he sent them to Lebanon, 10,000 a month by courses. A month they were in Lebanon, and 2 months at home. A month at Lebanon, 2 months at home. A month at Lebanon, 2 months at home. Of course, when you come home, you work on your crops so you have something to eat for your family. And then you work for the government for another month. Labor conscription. He also received foreign tribute and gifts. There's many, many references for this. Chapter 10, verses 24 and 25. I think I already read that. But anyway, let me just mention to you, I'll give you some of these numbers. He got 25, get this, tons of gold every year from foreign tribute. 25 tons of gold. He also had 500 shields of gold. Why would you need shields of gold? Anybody know anything about gold? Is gold very tough to use as a shield?
It's very malleable.
No. What was this for? Yes.
Parades.
This is for the parades. This is for the showing off. Here comes 500 soldiers prancing through with their shields up, and everybody looks at them and they're made of gold. Okay, this is to impress. This is not to fight with. He had his throne made of ivory and overlaid with gold. His throne was overlaid with gold. Okay? Everything's fine. You can do that when everybody's happy. When everybody's not happy, they're going to be making a beeline for your throne. Right? Give me a piece of that. I want just a little piece of it. He had household utensils made of gold. Again, this is probably not every day they ate off golden spoons, but he had many utensils made of gold for the parties and the feasts and showing off. He had 4,000 stalls for horses. Everything was to impress. Everything was to just, not just say, wow. Everything was to blow your socks off, you know. That would not be a good smell in some places. Every year he imported from other countries ivory, silver, apes, peacocks, and all kinds of other animals, exotic animals, cedar wood, all kinds of things. All right, anybody impressed yet? This financial support that came in on a yearly basis was designed, as I mentioned, just absolutely blow you away. Boy, you just see these things. And of course, the Queen of Sheba walks in. If you can just picture, not just one room or one building, but just building after building after building, and servants everywhere, and all of these people dressed the same. And not just dressed the same, but, covered in gold, and all of these just ridiculous off-the-wall things designed to impress. Let's also then next talk about his foreign relations. His foreign relations. This is still under the program as king. His foreign relations. He obviously had lots of alliances. That's a big part of the reason he had so many wives, was to build up these foreign alliances. Let's see what God said about this, what Moses said about this. Back in Deuteronomy chapter 17, this is what Joel mentioned a little bit ago. Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 14. Moses here has prepared Israel. He's told them, there's going to come a day when you're going to want a king. Now, I really believe God intended all along for Israel to have a king. We've mentioned this. Saul was the people's choice. They got ahead of God's plan. David was God's plan. God always intended for David to be a king, I believe. But go back to verse 14, chapter 17, verse 14. When thou art come into the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee, and shalt possess it, and shalt dwell therein, and shalt say, I will set a king over me. When you do that, you're gonna want a king someday, okay? Thou shalt in any wise set him king over thee, whom the Lord thy God shall choose. Yes, in other words, David. One from among thy brethren shalt thou set as king, set king over thee. Thou mayest not set a stranger over thee, which is not thy brother. Sound familiar? That's the reason our American founders said that the president has to be a citizen of America, a natural-born citizen. Okay? He's supposed to be one of you. If he's a foreigner, obviously he doesn't have your interests. He doesn't know your interests. Sorry, foreigners. It's the way it was. But he shall not multiply horses to himself, nor cause the people to return to Egypt, to the end he should multiply horses. For as much as the Lord has said unto you, ye shall henceforth return no more that way. Neither shall he multiply wives to himself. Why not? Well, there's more than just that he's committing adultery. That his heart turn not away. Neither shall he greatly multiply to himself silver and gold. Oops. Okay, we got a problem. Solomon, we think of Solomon as a great king. He did a lot of great things. God multiplied to him gold and silver. But I really believe that Solomon went beyond what God intended. I think that's probably an understatement. He went beyond. Was he supposed to have gold and silver? Yes, but he made it his life goal to have everything about gold and silver. There's a lot of evidence that Solomon had trade relations around the world, literally around the world. It's believed that he had trade relations with India and China. Okay? He had ships sailing, the Bible says, to Tarshish. Where's Tarshish? Spain. How do you get to Spain? You travel around the tip of Africa, the southern tip of Africa. Or then you travel all the way around the world, But either way, it's thousands and thousands of miles. What is the Cape of Good Hope? Is that the southern tip of Africa?
I was thinking they just contract the Phoenicians and go through the Mediterranean.
Oh, that's possible. That's possible. I don't think there wasn't a canal built then, though.
Well,
If the Red Sea went through at that time, that's
Phoenicia,
possible.
Tyre, and Sidon was north, and there was two big ship.
Oh, yeah, that's true. That's true. That's true. Good point. Jared?
I was going to say.
Okay, very good. So, anyway, so lots of, what does the Bible say here, though? Back to, in our thoughts here about Deuteronomy, that Solomon is, I believe, way overstepping the bounds. God intended for him to be wealthy, but beyond any kings, but he's has a continual income from foreigners that bring gold and silver, and many, many wives. His alliances had to do with his many wives, some of them had to do with establishing alliances with foreign countries. There's two foreign countries that are mentioned that we know that he had alliances with, as far as with his wives. Of course, Egypt, he married the daughter of the Pharaoh, built her a house, and of course, her father gave her a city, and Solomon fortified that city. 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 1. In 1 Kings 11:1, the Bible tells us that he married a daughter of the king of Tyre. Actually, it mentions more than that. But King Solomon loved many strange women together with the daughter of Pharaoh, women of the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, that would be Tyre, and Hittites. Okay? Now, Solomon wasn't supposed to have many wives because it's adultery. What are some other reasons he shouldn't have many wives? As if you need another one, right? What? Caesar is back there laughing about something. What would be another reason? What are those wives going to do?
Influence.
Influence. When you bring someone close to you and you trust them and you love them, which I don't know how I can love 1,000 people, 1,000 women, but so you trust them, okay? Hopefully. How do you keep from them turning your heart away? Obviously, they wouldn't want to be married to you if they're Christian. They're not Christian. They're not trusting in the true God of heaven. And so they're trusting in their own gods, and they're just happy to have a good life, right? We get to live a good life, man, being married to the richest guy in the world, one of many. So they're bringing their gods in, and so Solomon begins to turn his heart away, and he wants to please them, so he does nice things for them. And what do they want? They want their God appeased. All right. Also, under the foreign relations, let's touch on the visit by the Queen of Sheba. The Queen of Sheba. 1 Kings chapter 10. 1 Kings chapter 10 and 1 Chronicles chapter 9. Sheba, it's obviously a foreign country. It's a country far away. It's believed to be in the land of, in the continent of Africa, south of Egypt. Now, when you say south of Egypt, don't just think, oh, maybe 100 miles away. We're talking probably about 1,000, 1,500 miles south of Egypt. Sheba, it's very far. It had been months of travel. Queen of Sheba comes into the town of Jerusalem, sees this unbelievable, what she probably thought must be a fairy tale. It has to be a myth that there's a king so rich that his servants walk around in gold and everything is covered in gold and the streets are almost made of gold. I mean, everything is just pure riches. And so she hears this myth, this story of travelers coming through from wherever, the Far East, coming through Jerusalem and then down into Africa. and they say there's this king up there that has it'll blow your mind off how much riches he has. And she says, well, I'm going to go and check this thing out. If this is really true, I want to see this thing. And so she goes to visit, and of course, the half had not been told her. That just, as a little kid, were there any fairy tales you read? You girls, probably it's more true of you than others, than the guys, but fairy tales that you read and you say, wow, wouldn't that be something? Wouldn't that be fun to actually see that? That actually happened with the Queen of Sheba, that she got to fulfill her fairy tale dream. Anyway, thirdly, his writings. This is the third main point. We talked about his promotion to the throne, his program as the king. Now let's talk about his writings, Solomon's writings. I'll just mention these to you. Solomon wrote most of the book of Proverbs. He wrote most of the book of Proverbs. He also wrote the book of Ecclesiastes. Ugh. Don't read the book of Ecclesiastes on a cold, rainy day. And definitely not if you're already discouraged about something. When you need a lift, read Solomon's father's writings, not Solomon's writings, in Ecclesiastes. It will not give you a lift. All right, so the Song of Solomon also was written by Solomon about his love. It's believed that it was one of his wives, probably the daughter of the Pharaoh of Egypt. It's believed that it was about her. But he wrote the Song of Solomon. And then he also wrote some of the Psalms. He's credited with writing some of the Psalms that fit in with the other Psalms of David. Of course, he would have written those earlier in his reign. Okay, so those are some of his writings. And then lastly, let's talk about his decline. We know that Solomon declined. 1 Kings chapter 11. I hate this part of the life of Solomon. And obviously it happened over a long period of time. The things that happen later in chapter 11 with foreign kings turning against Solomon, that would have taken place over a number of years, could be 10, 20 years of the Solomon's reign that were filled with a bunch of miserable and angry people and foreign kings turning away from Solomon and refusing to pay their tribute and so on, realizing that Solomon's on his way down, and that the nation of Israel is not very happy with him, and so on. Could have been a number of years that this covered. So let's talk about this decline. It's two things that I want to mention. First, the cause. There's actually two causes. His many wives. Polygamy. That caused his downfall. What did the polygamy lead to? It led to paganism. Polygamy and paganism. Those are the causes of his downfall, no question. Chapter 11 says he married all these strange women. Verse 2, of the nations concerning which the Lord said unto the children of Israel, ye shall not go in unto them, neither shall they come in unto you. That means you're not supposed to marry them or commit fornication with them. For surely they will turn away your heart after their gods. Solomon clave unto these in love. It should say lust. Sorry, I corrected the King James Version of the Bible, didn't I? But that's not a true love. Okay, that's lust. And he had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart. For it came to pass when Solomon was old that his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not perfect. He went after Ashtaroth, the goddess of the Sidonians, after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. Verse 7, then did Solomon build a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, in the hill that is before Jerusalem. What hill is before Jerusalem? The Mount of Olives. And for Molech, the abomination of the children of Ammon, Well, verse 1 said he married wives of the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Edomites, the Sidonians, the Hittites. And so what did he do? He put up gods for each one of those people. Why? To appease his wives, his polygamy and his paganism. And what are the consequences of that? The causes we mentioned. Now the consequences. What's the consequences? Future civil war. Future civil war. The northern tribes didn't just leave and the southern tribes said, oh, okay, get on out of here, that's okay. No, there was war. Future civil war. Here in chapter 11 already, there's a prophet that comes on the scene. Gad is gone. Nathan is gone. Abijah is now the prophet. In verse 26, and I'm not going to read to you the whole passage, 26 through 40, there's a prophet named Abijah who comes on the scene. Let's see here. Do I have Abijah? Maybe that's supposed to say Ahijah. Sorry about that. Ahijah. Yes. Verse 29, Ahijah the prophet. And he prophesied that the kingdom would be split. Not down the middle. It would be split 10 and 2. Ahijah literally took his garment and he rent it off and he rent it into 12 pieces. And he gave away 10 of those pieces and he kept 2. And he said, okay, this is what's going to happen to the nation of Israel. 10 tribes would follow Jeroboam. And not only future civil war within the country of Israel, but also the foreign enemies would leave and stop paying tribute, and Israel would suffer because of it. And so he talked about the enemies that would depart. And you see that also taking place in chapter 11. Hadad of Edom. Well, I thought he had a wife from Edom. I thought that was supposed to cement his allies. It didn't. God punished him. Rezon of Damascus and several other foreign enemies turned their back on Solomon and actually started to fight against him and undercut him. And the diplomacy was failing, if you will. All right, so that's the end that we're going to discuss with Solomon. We'll see the death of Solomon under the next king when we move on into the split and the civil war. Okay, you have a test on Thursday. It covers to where I just finished. And I just finished right on time. Finished right on time. Finished right on time. Finished right on time. Finished right on time.